Hey all, here's the sermon from Solomon's Porch for March 31st. We have started into a 4-week series on Exodus and what that means, what it's about, and so on. So this is week 1. The sermon is a little longer than normal, and there's a couple of times where the audio drifts in and out, and that's because of where we had the microphone. So hope you enjoy this sermon from Solomon's Porch.
Now, you might know that in religion, there's a lot of seasons. In the Christian religion, we're in one that's called Lent right now. Lent is this period of time that goes from Ash Wednesday up until Easter. And people say it's a 40-day festival, a 40-day period. But you know it's not 40 days? Do you know actually how long it is from Ash Wednesday until Easter? There's a little fun fact that you should learn, a thing you can learn at church. Anybody know how many days? Yes, 46 days. It's 46 days because there's 6 Sundays. Now, why do they call it a 40-day festival? Because it's only 40 days that you're not allowed to say the Alleluia according to the Catholic and Orthodox Church traditions. So there's 40 non-Hallelujah days between Ash Wednesday and Easter. But you do get to say the Alleluia on Sunday. All of that to say, religions always have these curious and sort of confused kinds of traditions to them, as all culture does, as all ways of life do. This afternoon, I had on the television, on the TV at my house, professional golf. Because that's what middle-aged men of renown do. They're not afternoon golf on a Sunday. I'm starting to play some golf again this summer, and I wanted to watch it. And it's a particular kind of golf happening called match play. And match play means that instead of a score just at the end, everybody who wins a hole, that counts as a point, and then you see how many points you get. And there was this scorekeeping going on where they were saying, how did this person get to the championship round? And I know a lot about golf. I was on the golf team in high school. I own my own golf clubs. I had no idea what the scoring was going on in match play. It's complicated inside of its own little world. There's a lot of people who go to church regularly. They're involved in religion. They know stuff. But there's lots of little details, lots of pieces of it that aren't all that readily available to a lot of us. If you're Christian, you talk about this as a season of Lent, leading up to Easter. Or if you're the kind of Christianity that I started out in as a teenager, we didn't really do Lent. We just talked about Easter. And by the way, Easter is 3 Sundays from now. If you're Jewish, however, you might know that if you're Jewish, then you don't tend to root yourself around the Easter story or the Christmas story. You root yourself around the Exodus story. Now, if you were together with some Jewish rabbis or some Jewish scholars or some Jewish friends that pay attention to their faith, they would remind you that Exodus, the Exodus, which is a name of a book in the Bible, one of the readings that we had came from the book of Exodus today. The first 5 books of the Bible are arranged with Genesis and Exodus as the first 2. They're not just books of the Bible, they're actually a framing narrative. A start and then an Exodus. And in Exodus, very often in Jewish faith and carries over into the Christian faith, means something like a leaving. It's kind of like ascending. It's a bit of a crossing over into a new place. It's entering. It's Exodus. It's a big category. The Jewish notion of Exodus and the Christian notion of resurrection are brother and sister narratives. They're kind of the same thing. What for the Jewish faith, what for the Israelite people who, in the readings that we heard, were in captive and in bondage, in slavery in Egypt for 400 years, then Moses comes and is sent from God to go to the people and to say, you're now going to go into a new land, and your freedom is going to come. I have heard the words of the oppressed. If you heard Dave's reading of that, you've heard that it was a narrative of people held in bondage. All the things that Christianity talks about with forgiveness of sin, life in the midst of death, is all wrapped in that same way. They're brother and sister narratives. Now, they look a little different. They sound a little different. The way that brother and sisters look and sound a little different. Even if they're twins, they've got a different feel to them. So the Christian story of resurrection is not exactly the same as the story of Exodus. And the story of Exodus has some pieces to it that the story of resurrection doesn't have. But they're trying to say the same thing. So as we launch into a 4-week time of talking of Exodus, of entering, of crossing, of sending, of leaving, these are not just religious narratives in the Jewish tradition, or we'll find out in 3 weeks on Easter, the religious narrative of the Christian tradition. They're actually the ultimate human narrative. Susie's well-put phrase, how did you say that, Susie, about we didn't know we should give thanks for the safety of the womb? Is that how it read? Would you read that again?
We enter this world not knowing we should be grateful for the safety of the womb.
We didn't know that we enter this world and should be thankful to the woman for whom her womb was home. Isn't that an amazing idea? That what's happening in birth is a kind of exodus? It's a leaving. It's a crossing. If you've been around here at all, you've heard me sort of extol the unbelievable wonders that all of us were inside of a water-like, fluid-filled cocoon of our mothers, breathing in liquid, our body having the ability, like a fish, to take in liquid and to process that into oxygen and then to push it back out, all the way until we exodused, till we crossed, till we left, till we were pushed out, till we were born. Now we can't do that again. The human body can't breathe in hydrogen, oxygen in that makeup and turn it just into oxygen. We don't do that anymore. Something happens when you cross. Something happens when you leave. Something happens when you're sent. You're never the same again. Part of the reason that the Jewish tradition held on to Exodus as a framing narrative for life and faith of the Jewish people was because it's the thing we all know. It's the most rooted human experience that we can have. One of the reasons that Christianity wanted to tell the story of Jesus in the fullness of God and the fullness of human life in such ways, because that's the thing that makes sense to all of us. That's the thing we know. It's, I think, super, super curious. So I've been suggesting, and I will for the next 4 weeks again, through Easter at least, and maybe a little longer, that for me in the sermons that I'm doing here, I want to put an emphasis on 3 aspects, components, realities of Jesus. I'd like us to think about Jesus as a master teacher. It's been a struggle within Christianity from start to finish of how much emphasis do you put on the things Jesus did and how much emphasis do you put on the things Jesus said. I promise you, you can go to seminary, you can get a master's degree in this, and you can have an entire conversation about 2 different views of Christianity, that one rooted around the sayings and one rooted around the doings. Most people who endeavor in that kind of a practice begin to realize there's not a lot of value in pulling those 2 things apart. The sayings of Jesus and the doings of Jesus work together in this wonderful way. Had Jesus been about what he was doing, his sayings may not have held much weight. That's true of any master teacher, by the way. Nobody becomes a master teacher because they make a great phrase or 20 or 50 or 100 or write a great book. Most master teachers have figured out a way of doing, living, and being, and that's why you pay attention to them. But then on the other hand, had Jesus only been doing things and not said anything, not taught anything, not organized in a way that people could take that on and have it become part of their full life, including their thinking and their emotions and their experiences, it wouldn't have gone very far. So considering Jesus fully as an actor in the world, as someone who does things in the world, but also as a master teacher, is something I want us to hold on to for tonight. And I also suggest that Jesus wants to call for a way of humanity. That Jesus is not an idealist. Jesus is a pragmatist. He is calling for human beings to join him in living a way that's in harmony with God and one another in the planet in such a way that it brings about the only tolerable way for humanity to live with one another. It is super easy to take any master teacher and say, all conditions being right, maybe we would listen to that person. But in the real world, well, this is Jesus' whole point. Like, part of the reason that the Jesus narrative has him walking and teaching and healing and loving and caring and being abandoned and being harmed and being crucified, all of that is because that's what happens in real life. They try to root a way of humanity right inside the most realistic experience that you could get. And then the third, and I think these sort of are three sides to the same little triangle here, that Jesus as the Son of God is that as the brother of humanity. Jesus is not the magnificent exception. Jesus is the magnificent rule. This has been the thing that the earliest disciples and the most new converts realize. It's the thing that gets phrased in the ways in the New Testament where you should have the same mind of that of Christ, or the same spirit that empowered Jesus indwells you and me. This is the whole idea, that we're all part of the same family. All the kind of father language that you get out of Jesus, we're going to see it in a minute in this particular passage we look at tonight, it's all, it really makes sense when you see that what Jesus is doing is taking a narrative of Exodus that was for a certain people to go to a certain land and have a certain God, and Jesus opens up that certainness to everyone. And then says, you are all part of this family of belonging. So in this new leaving, crossing, sending Exodus, everyone gets included. All right, so there's a little phrase that we heard earlier. Dave, I think it was on your reading. Do you have the actual reading there?
Yep.
There's something about where Moses says, who am I that I should do such a thing? Can you read that, Ritish, read that little piece again?
Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?
Keep going from there.
And I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain.
I will be with you, and this will be the sign that I've sent you. That's God to Moses in the book of Exodus. Hold that, put that in your space somewhere to hold on to that phrase for a minute. So I don't know if you've seen Apollo 11 yet, but Apollo 11 is a movie about something that happened 50 years ago. 50 years ago, this July 20th, 1969, when the United States put together a plan in about 8 years and launched 3 men in a rocket up into the orbit of the moon. And they created this device, this rocket ship, this Apollo 11 that had a series of components that all came apart. This movie is all the live footage. It's no actors, it's no narrators, it's only live news footage and live other footage showing. They fly to the moon. They're inside the Apollo 11 capsule that has 2 parts to it, one called Eagle and one called Columbia. Eagle splits off and then goes on its own tracking and flies and lands on the surface of the moon, which is where the phrase, the eagle has landed, comes from. The other part of that is then renamed for the 3 days that they're, 2.5 days that they're on the moon, called Columbia, continues to circle the moon. And then the eagle launches back off of the moon, flies up, and meets back together with Columbia to become Apollo 11 again. Then when the guys climb, when Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong climb from the Eagle into the Columbia, then they drop off the Eagle and let it fly around in space. Then it flies back through our atmosphere, opens up parachutes, and lands in the Pacific Ocean. And these guys walked on the moon during that time. It's unbelievable. You should go and watch. First of all, just considering that happened, it's so spectacular. It's enough to make some people think there's no way that happened. In fact, there's a whole industry of people reminding you, it's that mind-blowing. I watched it happen on this film, and you're like, how is this possible? It's so incredible. This is the picture taken. Do you see how in the face mask, it's the reflection of Buzz Aldrin taking the picture? They have video footage of this up there. This picture is incredible. You can see the footprints of the moon boots in the surface of the moon. It's incredible. I was at Micro Center the other day, and this was hanging in the checkout counter selling you stuff before you check out. There's that same picture, right? Now, they decided to somehow dress it up a little bit, right? That's the actual picture. They took that actual picture and zoomed in and took this whole notion of landing on the moon. And what did they turn it into? An advertisement for Neapolitan ice cream sandwich that freeze-dried and ready-to-eat space food.
Yum.
I have watched the Apollo 11 movie twice. I'm so moved by this thing. Then I'm standing in line and I'm like, and 50 years later, they've turned it into a shtick to sell you a freeze-dried Neapolitan ice cream sandwich. That is a great question. I did not, but I can take a picture of it, use it for my own purposes. There's something sort of demeaning about that, right? This incredible happening gets trivialized into a freeze-dried Neapolitan ice cream sandwich. The Exodus, the leavings, the sendings, the resurrections, the people being freed from bondage, all that stuff. This stuff happens all the time with great happenings in our lives. They just get trivialized and turned into something else. I'd ask us to consider what we're about to read here and to know that there's no doubt it has been turned into a prepackaged, rebranded, religious, sellable item. But don't miss the actual story that inspired that rather genius and sort of depressing marketing campaign. All right. This comes out of the book of John. This is right at the end of Jesus' life. This is, by all accounts, the third to last paragraph in the original version of the Gospel of John, the end of chapter 20. You might know, if you're sort of a Bible nerd or went to college, Bible college or seminary, or just spent a lot of time in the Bible, there's 21 chapters in the book of John. There's sort of an addendum chapter. It's one of my favorites. I'm really glad it's there, the 21st chapter of John. But the Gospel of John is about to come to an end in its first, the first version with this bit. And it starts into something. And it reads like this. It was still the first day of the week. Now, this is super important in a way in the Gospel of John. You might know the Gospel of John starts out with a Genesis narrative at the beginning and then ends with an Exodus narrative at the end in the resurrection and the reappearance. The Genesis story in John at the beginning is, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Just like in the beginning of the Gospel, in the beginning of Genesis, it starts out with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So the Gospel of John wants to lay out a narrative that feels like the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus combined. What it does in the Gospel of John is it takes 7 actions and basically refers to them as 7 days, and they're called the 7 miraculous signs. There's the water into wine, leading up to the resurrection of Lazarus. Those are 7. And then on the first day of the new week in the Gospel of John, that's now the life of Jesus for all of humanity being brought in. A creation narrative for 7 days, 7 miraculous signs, and then a new week of Exodus living. This story is the Exodus story in the Gospel of John. Okay, that's just super interesting, and if you like that kind of thing, I just finished a whole book on this, so I'm really into it. It's called Outdoing Jesus, 7 Ways to Live the Greater Than Promise. So anyway, it's this call that Jesus has where Jesus wants humanity to join in the work that he's doing in the new creation. All of that to say that's the first sentence of this. I don't think the first sentence is interesting as that is as interesting as the last sentence, though. So it's the first day of the week, the first day of the new after the new creation and the new Exodus. That evening, while the disciples were behind closed doors because they were afraid of the religious authorities, Jesus came and stood among them. He said, "Peace be with you." Shalom is how it would be translated in Hebrew. The same word spoken from God to Moses, by the way. Peace be with you. And after he said this, he showed them his hands and his side, showing the marks from the crucifixion. When the disciples saw the Lord, they were filled with joy. And Jesus said again to them, "Shalom, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so am I sending you." This is the Exodus narrative, the thing David read earlier. Moses saying, how can I go to Pharaoh and say, let him go? Here's the sign that I will be with you till the end of the age, and that I have sent you. So now Jesus, becoming the new Moses in this story, then says, just as I'm sent by the Father in the family story as the big brother of this way of life, just as I'm sent, so am I sending you. In other words, the thing that I was about is the thing that you're about. This is the whole point of the Jesus narratives in the gospel. That which Jesus was doing, humanity is to do. Jesus, a few chapters earlier, has this great line where he talks about the 7 miraculous signs and says, these signs are really great, but those who believe in me, those who follow in this way, they will do even greater works than these. They're going to live in a whole new story of recreation and Exodus that's even greater than all of this. Now, does that greater mean more important? Does it mean better? Does it mean more than? Buy the book and you can get an answer to that question, or talk about it. So we can talk about it here in a minute. But this thing of Jesus saying, as the Father sent me, so am I sending you, is the thing that Moses says to the nation of Israel. God has sent me, and so now I'm sending the nation to go into a new land. Well, in that old Exodus story, what they do, and this is the part that Katie read for us, when they go into the new land, it's all about the land. It even names it. It says it's this place where these people are living. In fact, Katie, how does it read? It takes 11 days or something like this?
It takes 11 days to go from Porch to Kadesh Barnea by Mount Seir.
Yeah, like it's really specific. Like it's from this place to this place. And if you're going to get there on any average trip, it's going to take you about 11 days. It's like people that drive to Duluth all the time, and you ask them and you say, how long does it take to get to Duluth? They're like, oh, it takes you 2.5 hours. Is that how long it takes? 2.5 hours? Is that right, Tim? Dan? Yeah. People always have an opinion about this. 2:15, 2:45, 2:30. They'll have whole conversations, Minnesotans, about how long it takes to get to Duluth. Same thing in this land. Because to the narrative of the Exodus, it was all about the land. But watch what happens in this story. Instead of it being about conquest of land, instead of it being about one people group living alongside of another people group, in this story, as the Father has sent me, so am I sending you. If you forgive anyone's sins, they are forgiven. And if you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven. Now, my guess is many people in this room have seen that phrase before. And if you saw that, you will get into all kinds of, if you're not doing it already, all kinds of questions and commentaries about what does it mean to forgive, and what does it mean, who, and does that mean you can't have regrets, and does that mean we shouldn't have punishment? All the kinds of stuff you do when you just pull that story or that line out of the story and use it all on its own. But I think what's going on here is that Jesus is saying, in this new creation and in this new Exodus, the way you're going to live in this new place, the way you're going to live in this new way, is that forgiveness, freedom, the same thing that happens to the nation of Israel being freed from the captivity in Egypt, is that they are set free from their bondage. Forgiveness is all about freedom producing. That's what it does. Jesus could have said a lot of things. He said, the Father has sent me, so am I sending you. You're going to live forever. You're going to win. Those who turn against you will do it in vain. You should strike back as efficiently as you can. Make sure you set up a nation that's mostly about you and not about anybody else. He could have said, make sure you take care of yourself first. He could have said, or he could have said a whole lot of other things. He could have said, make sure you give it all away. But what he says is, let's root this in the same narrative as the Exodus of the nation of Israel, that it's a freedom narrative from bondage, which in this way is put in the term forgiveness. The ultimate statement of sin for a Jesus narrative is bondage, slavery, captivity. That which holds you and entraps you. That kind of stuff, right? That's what he's talking about all the time. Not talking about morality in some kind of a weird sort of, first century way. He's not talking about just don't think of it. He's talking about all the things that trap us and hold us and keep us. And then the response to that is forgiveness, is freedom, is sending, is crossing, is entering. So the thing that I think Jesus is getting at for people to cross into, saying that he wants to push, is to say to these people and to say to all the people, you are sent. You're leaving something. Leave your old way, leave your old life, leave your old traps. Cross into a new life. Enter into a new life. Exodus. And when you do, carry that same exodus with you. Be the very people who do the thing that you are being sent as. Be that very same thing. Live in that new way. This becomes the narrative. And that's why for anybody who tries to make Christianity only about a personal experience and not a collective social experience, it takes all the meaning out of it. And for anybody who only has Christianity be a social organizing principle for how we should act in the world, and it doesn't have something to do with the interior life that we all feel in bondage to or held to or in captive to or captivated to, then we miss the whole point of it that way. There's no separating the personal experience from the collective experience. They're one in the same. And they both, in my view, have to be taken fully and completely and aggressively. So what Jesus is entering into here is I'm sending you in the same way I have been sent. That idea that there's no distinction between the Father's sending of Jesus and Jesus' sending of the disciples and you and I living in that same narrative is that we're all part of the same Exodus. I mean, that was the thing about Moses. Moses was also in the group that was crossing the sea and was going to be freed. He's part of the same community. This is why at Solomon's Porch we try to do things in a life of community and all the rest of it. And when our social and school and spring calendars correspond, people go, they leave. I'm so thrilled on a night like this that we have a light night, because what it means is we got a whole bunch of people that are exodusing. They're crossing, they're leaving, they're getting out, they're somewhere else, they're in Arizona, they're in Mexico, they're up in Duluth, they're with their families launching spring break. They have crossed and are sent. I would encourage you to live your life in the next 3 or 4 weeks up through Easter as a sent, leaving, crossing, entering Exodus person. The one thing in all of these narratives that you see from Genesis through Exodus and into the Gospels is stay strong and don't turn around and don't go back. In the Baptist world that I was familiar with a number of years ago, they would call it backsliding, but they sort of meant it in kind of a mean way. Like somehow you were a failure if you were a backslider. Look, most of us aren't backsliders. We're turner-arounders. We just go right back to it. We all know. Think about that habit you're trying to kick. Think about the habit you kicked and now you're worried about it again. Think about the thought patterns that have changed. All of this stuff. There's become these moments where we just say, we're just going back in now. There's this proverb that was in the book of Proverbs and then shows up in the book of Peter. It's kind of grotesque and the kind of thing you pay attention to when you're a teenager when I first ran across it. But it has this sort of significance to it. Written by adults, not just by teenagers. Anybody know what it is? What I'm hinting at?
God returning to its vomit.
So does... Yes? What's the rest of it? So does a fool repeat his folly. As a dog returns to his vomit, so does a fool repeat his folly. I don't think the Proverbs writer or Peter quoting that or who the author of 1 Peter was just trying to be nasty or trying to be mean. I think they were just saying, oh yeah, no, that's how it goes. We all do that. We all just go right back at it again. That's why communities get together. That's why you eat meals. That's why you tell Exodus stories and resurrection stories, because you don't want to go back again. You are a sent people. You are a leaving people. You are a crossing people. You are an entering people. You are an Exodus people. That's what we get together to remind ourselves of. Let's don't go back. And then when you do, and you turn around and you go back, then you leave again. And you Exodus again. And then when you do it again, you do it again. It's what Jesus calls forgiveness. So the disciples say to him at one point, well, how many times should we do that? The customary 7 times? And Jesus' response is, no, 70 times 7, like a mathematical version of constant. Comments, questions, inputs, any of that stuff that you have about any of this?
I like the cyclical nature of what you're talking about and what we're thinking about, that it doesn't just necessarily have to be this flat, linear thing, like the kind of Christianity that I was taught when I was little is like that you're saved and then you're good and then you go on. And then there was this sense of that every time I wasn't in that place of living out what I thought I was supposed to live, that I was somehow failing or wrong. And I appreciate the grace embedded in the recognition of our human experiences being spiraling, our cycles. We never necessarily wind up in exactly the same place as we were, but we're always moving and growing, and that if we find ourselves back in similar places, that it's an opportunity to check in and keep going. It's not necessarily a failure, that the process can be a part of growth and opportunity and love and another forgiveness experience.
Yeah, nice.
The spiral of grace, not a failure. This is the first time I've heard that.
I've always appreciated how the Jews continue to recognize what God was trying to teach them.
Yeah.
So God brought he brought people through a lot of experiences and used those experiences as symbols or lessons or messages for all time.
Yeah.
So that we could always understand who God is, how he works, what's behind it all. And that all came from a series of events that happened a long time ago. Well, I'm just reflecting on how those events had to occur in real life for them to be told in modern day. And God had to put people through those experiences in order for them to have real meaning. Somebody had to be born into slavery in Egypt and have a terrible, terrible life so that we all and forevermore can understand how God works and how he loves us and cares for us. Well, they didn't experience the greatness of the message. They experienced the slave driver. It's tragic for them.
Yeah, nice.
And it makes me reflect on how my life is not necessarily just me. I can be part of a larger picture. And I don't expect God to be putting me into some great story that will be told forever and ever. But there is somewhat of a bigger picture.
Yeah, 400-year story. You could be in the midst of that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's great. Good. Do we have time for one more comment if there is one? And then we have these prayer places we're going to invite you to participate in. So, anybody else?